record this, Paul, for your own purposes, and you use it as reference, or are you actually going to make a film of all these people you've been?
Well, that's a great question. What I like to do, and this is up to you, is I like to post them on my blog.
That's fine. That's fine.
Excellent. Well, we've begun.
Okay.
Welcome, and thank you. I'm Paul Carrigan. I'm here with Dr. Sheridan Blau, who was the founding director and directed for 35 years the South Coast National Writing Project. Is a professor of practice in English education at Columbia University, Teachers College, Columbia University, and authored what is pretty much my favorite book on teaching, the literature workshop, Teaching Texts and Their Writers. And Sheridan has agreed to chat with me today about this. So thanks for talking with me.
My pleasure, Paul.
In the introduction to this book, to jump right in, you describe the process of how you came to your practice of teaching and your ideas about teaching, particularly in participating in and directing the National Writing Project site. And what you describe in these first pages of the book sounds to me just like this dream situation of collaborative pedagogical inquiry, like teachers and learners working together to figure out how to teach and learn well.
That's true.
And it makes me jealous. And so I'm wondering, for those of us who don't have like a site like that nearby, maybe not a close National Writing Project site, what advice would you have for fostering this kind of pedagogical collaboration?
That's an interesting question. And that's funny. I don't remember saying, I guess I did describe the Writing Project site. I mean, the Writing Project, anybody who runs a writing project, or people who are in a writing project, I've written about this actually, is that a writing project is the ideal learning environment. And I did publish an essay on this once, making the claim that what happens, what changes teachers, right? There's a long history of claims that teachers are transformed by the Writing Project. And there has been a dissertation on it and a very good article in RTE about it by Ann Whitney, in which she shows what kind of transformation teachers undergo in the Writing Project. And it has a lot to do with their writing. And she talks about how they discover that they are different kinds of people. That is, that they have authority as teachers, that they know things that will matter to people. And so she makes a adaptation of Mesereau's transformational learning theory to develop a theory of learning that takes place in the Writing Project. And it's very interesting. I've made a claim that is related to that. And my claim is that what happens to teachers in the Writing Project, aside from their acquiring a set of assumptions about new assumptions about who they are and what they can do and how important their knowledge is that quite aside from from that experience, and quite aside from all of the techniques for teaching writing that they pick up from each other and the theories that they pick up, they have an experience of learning, of being a learner in the Writing Project, an experience of what it means to learn that's different from any experience they've had before. And that model of what it means to be in a community of people who are actually inquiring and figuring things out and trying to make sense of what's going on is what changes them, because they want their classrooms to become those kinds of places of learning. You know, there are people who write about third space, the first space, the second, and sometimes I think it's Chris Gutierrez talks about the first space as the official space in the classroom. Second space is the counter classroom the kids are doing against the class. The third space is, for her, is the moments when things are real, something's really happening, and it's not school anymore. And I think the Writing Project is a third space in that sense, that it's a space in which people are actually there to learn. And we have to remember that there's no promotion. You don't get extra money for, you know, what could do. People used to get stipends in the Writing Project. But people are there to learn for its own sake, to be better teachers and to help each other be better teachers. So it's an ideal learning situation. And I think it's the model that people then start to expect in their classroom. But what I want to say is that it seems to me that literature classes, I don't want to claim that I was imitating the writing project, but what I was saying is that that writing project experience is a model of learning, and that's the kind of model I want to see in every class, in writing classes and literature classes as well. But it seems to me that the workshop, and what I love about, and the reason I came to use workshops, is the workshop help to create a space in which that's what students are doing. Because what a workshop does, it usually poses a problem or a difficulty, and people work together to solve it. I should say, let me say something else about this. When I was, for some years, I was the director of the writing program at UC Santa Barbara, the undergraduate writing program. And we had a fairly large faculty of lecturers, and there were ways there in which they could be promoted in that system, so they had fairly permanent positions. And we had to review people and watch them teach. And people knew that I used writing groups a lot in my own teaching. And so a lot of the classes I visited, I saw people using writing groups. And what I saw then was that they used writing groups because they thought they should have groups. They should have people in groups. But what I didn't see much of, I mean, the people who were just using because they knew I liked writing groups is the problem, is what they did is they would put people in groups to do things. But what they were doing didn't need a group to be done. Does that make sense? You didn't really need a group. It was, you go in a group now and do something. Well, why were they in groups? They were because one can say, well, groups work better. And it's true. People are more likely to talk in small groups than they are in large groups. That's fine. But I would say that the key to using groups, and the reason I want to use groups in classrooms, is because you can do things better in that group than you can do elsewhere. You need a group. And to try to do it in a group of, so what would be done? For example, a passage in a text that we're trying to understand that's really hard to understand, and you want to figure it out. Well, if I have a whole class of 15 or 20 people, it would be a lot harder for people to make contributions to have the experience of figuring it out. So I'll put them in groups of 3. And that makes sense? So everyone can. So people, we might be able to figure it out very well in the group of 15, even better, but not everybody is going to contribute and everybody will be engaged, because they'll let a few people do it. But if they're in groups of 3, then they have to try to figure it out themselves. And things, you need other people's help for passages that are really difficult. So I suppose I haven't, it's funny that I haven't talked about this way before. But I think that is, your question makes me think about it in a new way, and that the workshop idea is to have people working on a problem that's a legitimate problem. And I have them working on it in groups usually because they need other people to work on it. They can do work better and if the groups are small. And the workshop can include things that involve the whole class at once. And for example, I will typically debrief the workshop by talking to the whole class, asking people what they discovered, what happened in your group, to report on what happened, so groups hear one another. So you're building knowledge that way too. I realize that in my own teaching these days, I guess maybe not entirely true, but I want to say the place where I use the workshop most for inquiry is in a Milton class that I teach. Every other year I do a class in Paradise Lost. I used to do it every year in Santa Barbara with undergraduates, but here I'm doing it with doctoral students mostly, and always a couple of master's students join. And we do Paradise Lost and some other work. But there are so many problems in that text that need working on that are not clear to anybody. And so many problems that need to be figured out that I use people in groups a great deal, and then groups come back and report what they found. And we're really building knowledge, building a better understanding of that poem than we had before. It's filled with difficult problems. I expect I could spend a lifetime. I know I can spend. I have already spent a lifetime working on that text.
So it sounds then that a strategy that if we don't have a national writing project nearby and you wanted to bring some of this into, say, your local English department, you could, like one of my colleagues just did last week, said, hey, I've got this problem, come talk with me about it. And if it's a genuine teaching problem and you brought that to your colleagues, you could probably get some genuine pedagogical inquiry going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, well, I have written this about this too, that the writing project is what the university was supposed to be. Because the university was supposed to be a community of learners, a community of scholars, contributing to knowledge, building knowledge as a community, you know, in the various disciplines. And I think the university is that sometimes, like in special centers, research centers. And I assume it's that way in certain scientific labs where a whole team of people are working together, trying to figure out what's going on. But I think, so you have it in particular precincts of the university, but universities become, you know, more corporatized and so on. You know, I wasn't thinking about this when I wrote my book. I wasn't thinking about situated learning very much. I hadn't read Levin Wenger or the literature on situated learning yet, I don't think. But I'd say that there's a whole lot of conversation now about making classrooms into learning communities, or what people often say, communities of learners. I don't know if you've read Levin Wenger or know that work, but people in education.
The communities of practice?
Yeah, communities of practice.
I thought I remembered you citing that.
Did I?
That's what I'm trying to double check.
Oh yeah, let me get my own book. Wait a minute. What I'm going to do is look I'm going to look in the references, see if I refer to them.
At page 5 and page 56.
I do. Do I refer to Levin Wenger?
Or is it a different Wenger?
Nope. I do. I guess I did. I did. All right. That's nice.
The next thing I want to ask you about, you present in this book a workshop model, and you present it as an alternative to what you describe as the typical model. And I'll give a quote on page 18 of your kind of description of what you find as typical. It's from the footnote 1 there. It says, the culture of literature instruction in college and universities seems hardly changed and remains largely product-oriented, text-centered, and top-down. And so my question is, how do we really know what the typical literature classroom is like? And do you have a sense that maybe it has changed in the years since you have written this book?
Maybe. I think the first or second year I was here at Columbia, I had a questionnaire. I sent a questionnaire around to the master's students, asking them what were their English classes, literature classes like in college. And I had a set of questions for them to answer that would distinguish, you know, essentially what amounts to a lecture, somebody telling them what things mean, as opposed to a class in which they're exploring meaning themselves and engaged in building meaning. And it wasn't, it turns out that a lot of these students had that experience. It wasn't a majority, but it was clear that there were more people who were teaching literature, not by simply giving lectures of interpretation that students were there to passively buy, but that they were working with students to build knowledge and to interpret with the students. It was still the minority, and I did supervise one dissertation here in which the doctoral student in his dissertation visited something like 15 literature classes. He went to universities, including Princeton, He went to 3 universities, I think, or 3 or 4 universities. He went to a few small colleges, and he looked at high school classes. And he found almost no classes in which teachers weren't telling students the meanings of text, weren't doing the interpretation of texts. Now, and I think his classes, the classes he was looking at were undergraduate. He didn't have a large sampling, he had a fairly small sampling, but he went to a lot of places. And I do believe he was looking at people teaching undergraduates. I later heard one of the people he watched at one of the universities. I later heard about from one of my students, and the person had a reputation of being that way. So he happened to just pick that person. If he could have picked in that department who were different. I also want to say that this model of learning that I think is so important. I mean, first of all, when I say this model of learning, it's not a new model. We've always known that learning is what you do. It's what happens to you. It's what you do. It's not what you hear. What you hear is information. And sometimes that information answers questions you have, and so you can have an experience. But I'm building on the notion that learning is experiential. You have experience of something. So just getting somebody telling you what a text means doesn't mean you actually know what it means. You know that they know what it means. And then maybe you know the words to say about what it means. But it hasn't been your own experience. I've written about that since then. I don't think I talk about it in the book that way. I talk about typical learning experiences in English classes are often what you learn is hearsay. That is, it's not your knowledge, it's somebody else's knowledge. And in a court of law, it generally doesn't count as knowledge. You can't use it as evidence because you don't really know it. You just know that somebody else knows it. It's what somebody else told you. And so that model, I think isn't real learning. On the other hand, shortly after my book came out, when the English department in Santa Barbara, there's in the University of California, there are steps at every rank, and you get merit increases. You never get a raise except for other cost of living raises, but most of the raises are based on these steps you move up. And so when you write every year or every couple of years, every 3 years, depending what your rank is, you're reviewed for a merit increase. And so I was being reviewed in the English department when my book came out. And I ran into a very distinguished scholar, one of the best Renaissance scholars in the country, who's since died. And as I mentioned, my friend and colleague Richard Helgerson, who was a great scholar of the Renaissance, one of the best ever. And he came to me and he said, "Sheridan, I understand that we should all be ashamed of how we teach literature." He said, and I said, "No, Richard, you shouldn't be ashamed at all. Because if I were in his class, I don't want to hear any students talking about, I want to hear what he thinks of those texts. And first of all, it would be, his classes were always upper division classes or graduate classes, doctoral classes. And if you're a doctoral student in an upper division class, I have been working on the text. If we're studying a text, I've been working on it hard. I've been reading about it. I know a whole lot about it already. And I want to hear what Richard has to say about it. I mean, I'm sure I want to hear what my colleagues have to say about it too. But I don't mind the lecture then. I want it because the lecture is answering questions that I have. I'm a full participant. So I don't want to say that there's no place for lectures on literature. There may be. And I also have to say that I have students, very good students, who have said to me that they feel that they have learned the most from me when I lecture. And I think that that's just because we've all been doing a lot of things together. And at the point at which I'm lecturing, I'm essentially, what I'm doing is it's the equivalent of writing when you've been thinking about something for a long time and trying to write it down. And I think what I'm doing in that lecture is writing, as it were, helping them write, make more clear to themselves what they've been doing and what they're thinking, which in fact makes me think that I still shouldn't do it. I should have them do it. I should make them give the lecture. So I'm not sure how I feel about lectures. I trust these students that there are times when lectures really valuable. And I gave a lecture in a Milton class 2 years ago. We could, it was a snowstorm and we couldn't meet. And we have something called Canvas. A lot of universities are using Canvas now. And it allowed you to have a conference. And so I gave a lecture. We had small groups too, but I gave a lecture online, and people thought it was very useful. But again, it's because we had been in the community working on problems for a long time. And I was sort of summarizing what I thought we could find.
I like that idea that the lecture would be most useful in the context of already having been working on this problem.
Yeah, the typical lecture that kids undergo in college. I even remember, you go to a lecture, Western Civ or something, and somebody's telling. So I mean, and I don't know who talks about it this way, but I've heard it talked about. The idea is somebody's throwing answers at you for questions you never asked.
Yeah. The next thing I want to ask you about, at several points in this book, you, like on page 57, you make the claim that I quite like, that learning to interpret literature, studying literature, ought to and/or does develop kind of universal critical thinking skills that can be applied, kind of evidentiary reasoning skills that can be applied broadly. And I really like this argument because, one, it makes my discipline relevant. But I'm thinking about in writing studies and elsewhere recently, some of the work that's been done on the question of transfer has found that even things that you would think would be easy for students, for someone that they learn in one context to transfer and apply in another context, such as writing in their first year writing class and then moving to their biology class and writing, or moving to a job and writing, and that it's very difficult to bring those skills along. And so I'm wondering if then with literature, where the skills for reading aren't always even as visible as the writing skills, I wonder if transfer would be even harder. I would just, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I do. I've been thinking a lot about it. So what I want to say is, what I didn't do in the literature workshop, and I've been doing since then, and if I ever revised it, I would add it, is the kind of, so I'm going to tell you a story to answer your question. But what I've been doing in literature classes, and started doing in a Milton class in about 2005. And I do talk a little in my book about having students write. I forget what I said. Maybe I don't think I call it commentaries in here, but I do. I remember I credit my colleague. I have students write questions. I write about every weekly, right? So what that became in my Milton class was what I called commentaries. And each week students would write commentaries about the text that we were reading. And those commentaries, at the beginning, I said I didn't want to have anybody writing a thesis. I wanted people to focus on questions. But sometimes they would have a thesis, and I realized, well, they needed to because they were arguing for a particular reading against somebody else's reading. In any event, I've developed the commentary into a pretty elaborate, not elaborate, but I have a workshop on it and a way of introducing it. And it's become a real method for in my own teaching, and many of my students use it. And what it involves is having students write every week about what they're reading, and then putting it online, and then having students respond to each other's commentary. So they're all engaged in a discussion of literary texts. And I define a commentary as a contribution to a discussion of a literary text. So they're all making contributions to that discussion, and then they're commenting on each other's work. They're responding to each other. So they're engaged in arguments and dialogue. So I mean, it's basically a discussion, but it's a discussion of a literary work. And I encourage, particularly, I have them look at what people are doing in commentaries, so they start learning from each other what they might do, and they recognize that if they ask questions, it's often very productive. And they might realize that if they talk about how they feel about a text, or if they talk about how they used to feel about a text, but now feel about it. So in other words, they're developing in this course of doing this a repertoire by paying attention to what other people are doing and processing what we do from time to time. They're developing a repertoire of things you might do when you're writing about literature, things you might say. And what they're discovering in the course of doing this is that and one of the rules I make for teachers is that you don't criticize what anybody does. You just let them do it. And I build this very much on the idea of communities of practice and that and notion of apprenticeship, that you see, but you help them notice what other people are doing. So we all sort of learn, oh, I could do that. I could read a poem that's written about a girl and write about it from the point of view of the girl rather than the point of view of the narrator. So there are lots of critical moves I can make, interesting moves, and interpretive moves I can make, and we're all recognizing what these are. So what I've claimed about this, and I think is true, and what I believe is true of the workshop, if you have kids in a workshop, is that what students are discovering is that they are the kind of people who can talk this way and do these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of students come into a classroom and I have nothing to say about literature. I'm not the kind of person who talks about literature. You know, I'm not weird like my English teacher. You know, he reads all the time. I don't read all the time. But if you start talking about literature and you're talking to other people about it and you're starting to figure things out, you become that kind of person. Does that make sense? In other words, you're becoming something like an intellectual, something like a member of a community of learners. And if you so here's what this has to do with transfer. My argument is that this transfers because you've become a different kind of person because of your participation. And of course it transfers because you take yourself with you to whatever other class you're going to. So the learning transfers because you've been changed by the experience. You're not transferring knowledge, right? You're changed, and you're going to bring that to any class you go to. And I actually think that's why we talk about kids not being able to transfer. I'll bet you didn't have that trouble. I didn't have that trouble. I didn't have the trouble about, it never occurred to me to have that kind of trouble of writing. I mean, I remember when I graduated, when I was early in graduate school, I had a friend who was in dental school, and I helped him write a dental article, right? Because I was a confident writer. I mean, if you become a confident writer and you figure, I can figure out the languages and you can do certain things. So and it was my argument has been that the problem with transfer is a fake problem. It assumes that it's knowledge that transfers. But if students are really learning, they're becoming something different. They're becoming different people in their composition classes. I think the goal of a composition class is to have students become members of the university community, intellectuals. People who write and figure things out and who make fine distinctions and who do the kinds of things we're always telling students to do in our feedback on their papers.
Are you familiar with Patrick Sullivan's recent book, A New Writing Classroom?
You know, I know Patrick very well, and we've done two books together.
Oh,
yeah.
That's right. That's right. The
Deep Reading and one of the volumes of the writing book. But I don't know that book of his.
I think
I don't.
It seems very.
A New Writing Classroom?
Yeah.
I bet you Cheryl has that. She ought to. I'll make sure I get it. I don't know.
It's
a great admirer of Patrick's things.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say what you just talked through out loud. That really is helping me put together kind of what I've come to through reading his book about teaching writing and what I've been working on in teaching literature. And in fact, your answer to that, I think anticipates my next question, which is, in much of the book, you describe workshops that are intended to develop certain understandings or certain skills. So like this workshop develops the understanding that problems are helpful and not obstacles. This workshop develops the skill of making sense of this text in terms of that text. And so much of your book is very nuts and bolts practical like that. And at the end, you talk about, you kind of shift gears a little bit. You talk about dispositions. And you put it under a category of performative literacy.
Yeah.
On 210.
Yeah,
And
it's funny that I didn't think of that as part of my answer to one of your questions. My table just collapsed.
And you list 7 of these, including like the capacity for sustained focused attention, willingness to suspend closure, and so forth. And it seems to me, and especially now, so in light of your answer just a moment ago, that these fit really well in terms of recent scholarship on habits of mind. And I'm thinking of the framework for success in post-secondary writing, which
Right.
talks about things like not structure and citation and thesis sentence, but curiosity and creativity and openness.
Right.
I said, it seems to me that that's what needed in my question here, which you anticipated in your answer, that what's needed is not just that we learn to do certain things, but that we learn to be certain kinds of people.
Yeah. You know, it's amazing. I didn't think of that myself to say that. But that's what performative literacy is, which I used to call humane literacy. Many years, I used to give workshops and talk about these same kinds of characteristics, and I used to call it humane literacy. And that seemed to me less descriptive of what I was doing, although I like that still. But I call it performative because the idea is this enables you to perform, to do things in a certain way. Yeah, that is, you're changed. If you become a person who does these things. It's funny, I hadn't connected that. I can't believe I never did. I never connected that myself to the other kind of transformation I've talked about, which is to say becoming an intellectual. But of course, that's what it amounts to. Or it's at least part of what it amounts to. I know why, because I developed that idea about literacy before I wrote my book. And I saw the activities I was doing, the workshops I was doing, as enabling people to develop those qualities. I saw that, but I didn't, you know, and I had read Leaden-Wenger, but somehow I wasn't thinking of, I was still thinking of individual minds developing. I wasn't thinking about the other necessity of that development in a community. That's interesting.
So
I knew something that I didn't know yet. I mean, it was there, but I understand it better now, and more completely now.
I'm thinking of kind of the old Matthew Arnold sense of literature as kind of a religion almost, that the study of it changes you. But it seems like what you're talking about shares something in common, except that it's not like the spiritual message of the literature changes you. It's the habits of learning to read that change you.
I think that's right. It's the habits you acquire, and that's the part that I didn't say or know then. It's the habits that you acquire and the sense of your own changing identity as a person who does this stuff. That's what I wasn't there for me at the time I wrote my book, was the transformation. I saw it as a transformation in the student. Yes, that he acquired these habits of mind, but I didn't see that as he becomes a different person. That is, he shifts his identity also.
So this really makes teaching literature a very weighty, ethically laden kind of thing.
I think so, and I think that I would say that it's even more obvious in the writing classroom, because the writing classroom, they are constructing themselves as intellectuals. The writing is an act, an intellectual act. It's an act of formation, an act when you're forming ideas and shaping them and using them, and you're a person who you become a person who does that. I think literature class, I think it's true of the literature class, but by virtue of the fact that you're talking and writing in the literature class.
I was talking to Gerald Graff who the other day, and he also has this idea that we want to help students become intellectuals, and I'm seeing some overlap between your approach, but his.
You and I have argued a little about this. The question is that he may think about it now. I haven't talked to him in a couple of years, but we used to talk a lot. And my argument with him was that his idea of the I say, we say, what they say, I say, is that these are just moves that you make, whereas, and they were pretend arguments, whereas what I'm doing in my workshops, my commentary workshops, is they're not fake. You are saying something to somebody else who's actually there, that you're writing to. It's not, and so I know that Jerry Graff talks about becoming a member of the university and finding what it means to be an academic. And he used to say, it's because you've learned to make certain moves. And I would want to say, it's not that you've learned to make the moves, you've learned to be a person of a certain kind. And in making those moves, you become that person. And then you're not thinking about, I should make the move or not, you're going to make it. Does that make sense?
It does. And I was thinking of maybe a related way to frame what I see as the difference. That when he defines an intellectual as one who makes arguments, and you seem to be, and to oversimplify a bit, defining an intellectual as one who finds problems.
That's right. Who asks questions.
The question.
Yeah, I would argue with him. We did have a little argument openly about this. That my argument is, let me see. My argument is yes, that you need to be actually engaged with other people in working on problems and talking about them, engaged with text, talking back to texts. That the idea of making an argument seems to me much too limited. But what really is happening is, I think, and most productively, is dialogue. I mean, I know Andrea Lunsford and others have said, well, everything is an argument, which I never understood. Because if everything's an argument, nothing's an argument. You know, how does an argument differ from anything else? But I think they may mean that maybe that's what she means when she says everything's an argument. Everything is a version of asking a question, looking, trying to solve a problem, advancing an idea. But people who do those things are intellectuals. And I think I think the university was at one time had a very clear notion of what it was doing. That, I think that's probably what they even meant when they said we're making gentlemen, when universities and colleges were all men. We're here to make you gentlemen. Well, I think that the best teachers and best intellectuals at the time meant by that people who are engaged in a certain kind of discourse, who know how to ask questions, who are seeking knowledge, who are making contributions to knowledge in the community. They're people. They're intellectuals. I've argued in an essay once that's broader than being that's not simply academic writing. It's broader than that. We're not just teaching academic writing. I think we're teaching people to engage in intellectual discourse. There's a new book you may know called, I think, Crafting the Self by Nicole Wallach.
Say that again.
Her name is Nicole Wallach, and her book is called, I think, Crafting the Self. It's a book on the essay. And her whole book advocates that we should be teaching, we go back to teaching students the essay. Because and what I didn't like about it, she even says we're not doing academic writing. She's the head of the writing program at Columbia. And I went to one of her sessions once where she was training works with the TAs. And I had some reservations about her work, but I don't anymore. Because what she thinks of as the essay is that her knowledge, her model of the essay is a text, the making of which and the production of which enable, in that process, you're doing all the things you would do in any kind of academic writing. It includes it. And so I would argue with her when she tries to distinguish it from academic writing. She thinks of academic writing as this, you're making this bare argument or something, you have this thesis. I don't think academic writing is that anyway. But what I like about her book is that it really is clear about the intellectual values that you are enacting in an essay with an audience, and she also interestingly calls it, I think, crafting the self. And I hadn't thought about the fact that what she's talking about in crafting the self is that you put yourself there. You're there with your own voice and as a person. But what I hadn't thought about that is implied by that, and I'll talk to her about this, is that you're actually crafting a kind of self, a self who does this. You're becoming a self. And I think that's what universities are about. I think that's what education is about. I think that's what liberal education is about. I mean, and in some ways, vocational education is about it too. You become a carpenter, you're a mechanic. You become the kind of person who does these things and knows how to do it, knows how to talk about it. Maybe.
I have a few more questions, and I'm so enjoying talking with you.
I am too, because I think I feel as if I'm learning a lot from this conversation too. So I really appreciate it, Paul.
In your acknowledgments, you mentioned that on page XI, that one person who is a bigger influence on this book and on you than might otherwise be apparent through the citations, I think is how you put it.
Yeah.
Is Louise Rosenblatt.
Yeah.
And I just recently, she was an important influence on one of my teachers, and so I've been influenced for Ricky Cotton.
I don't know, but she was an English ed person. Huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I've been influenced by her indirectly for years, and then just recently went back and read her three main books and loved them a lot. But I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about her and what you draw from her.
I teach her book, usually Literature's Exploration, almost every year. And I teach a course here called Seminal Text in English Education, so I teach it every year. But I didn't teach it very often before I came to Columbia. And in Santa Barbara, in about 2005, a couple of years after my book came out, I did teach her book. I had read it years and years before that, many years before. I taught her book, and so I reread it. And I remember saying, as I was rereading to myself, oh my God, why didn't I cite her? So I say, I know that I was influenced by her, but I didn't even realize how much. And it's not even this question of how much. It's a question of that it's almost as if Louise said everything. There's nothing else to say. I mean, I had the feeling that my book did things that Louise never did. I thought that I was, cutting new ground here. I'm clearing new ground that she hadn't taken care of. And it's only slightly true. I mean, what Louise doesn't do very much is deal with kids who feel they can't read, kids who won't read. She deals with what readers do, but not with what. But when I reread her book in about 2005, I was in a graduate course in Santa Barbara, and I remember saying to my students, I forgot that Louise said this. Here it is. You can't get beyond her. I was thinking things I felt I was discovering and articulating as a discovery, she had actually said in one way or another. And it's like, you can't get beyond her. It's like Moffat. You can't get beyond Moffat. I think there is nothing anybody has said about writing and the teaching of writing and the learning of writing that isn't in Moffat. and I know it's to treat them as if they're saints and as if they're holy texts. But I feel that way about Moffat and about Louise, about that first book. I mean, she doesn't talk about workshops, but she talks about the importance of conversation, the importance of figuring things out, the importance of finding this learning for yourself. And of course, she was powerfully influenced by Dewey. So, for whom the model of education was experience. I'll just add one thing about, and Dewey wasn't the first either, that Milton says things like that. I think Paradise Lost is fundamentally about that. The only real learning is experience.
What do you think, kind of looking ahead as teachers of literature or scholars of the teaching of literature, what are the questions or the problems that you think we should be looking at, thinking about in the years ahead?
I think one of the unresolved problems we need to think about more is the relationship between literary theory and the independent readings that I want students to do. I don't want to be against theory, but I'm trying to remember now. I just saw something. Somebody was telling me. I mean, the idea that students are being asked to read in a particular way bothers me. I want them to read in their own way, and I want them to discover their own theories that are. Every reading, I mean, I do believe it's true that there is no reading that isn't based on a theory, but I think that what we might think, but there are only a few official theories. And I think, in fact, one of my workshops does deal with that. The workshop I have on, it's not where your interpretations come from. Let me see if I can find, what's worth talking about, what's worth saying about a literary text. That chapter, what's worth saying about a literary text, explores the things that are worth saying. And what's worth saying, the answer to that question is whatever a student has to say when he's really trying to make sense of what he's reading. But the end of that chapter actually takes up the question, how did you know what to say? And the answer always is because you have a theory. You have a theory, because, I mean, and this, we know this from, there's a lot of evidence from conversational analysis that when people are talking in conversations and someone takes a long turn, which is what the conversational analysts refer to, that's how they talk about story. When you tell a story, it's usually a long turn. That story is usually a story that gives an example of something that you've been talking about. You've been talking about something that happened to you, and then I'm giving another example in the story. And the point is that that story is built around some generalization that you're making. This is how the world works, and here's an example of that. So every interpretation, if you interpret a story and say, "Oh, I see it in the story that this, this is obviously about adolescent angst and adolescent anxiety about what other people think, and that's what's bothering this kid." As soon as you do that, you're doing it because you have a theory about how kids act and how kids think. Does that make sense? So I think theories are behind all our interpretations, and we have to respect all the interpretations that students might bring to a text, and that they already own, that are part of them, and not just the official ones that post-colonial and Marxist and so on. And my fear about teaching theories is that they, as it were, become the only respected ways of talking about text.
Well, your answer, I think, will make you appreciate the way that my teacher, who I mentioned earlier, Ricky Cotton, taught me literary theory and the other students in his class, which is, we read the different theories and theorists, but the final paper of the course was, all right, now write your literary theory.
Oh, how interesting. All right, but what's wrong with that is the implication that you have one. And I'd say you're carrying around dozens, hundreds. And as we get older, we have more and more.
Write a literary theory of yours, maybe. I don't want to misrepresent his assignment. Well, I've had such a blast talking with you. And the last thing I want to ask you is just if there's anything else that you want to say, either about the literature workshop or about teaching literature, or any of the things that we've touched on so far that I haven't asked you.
Well, no, except I'm going to say that it's been an enormous pleasure for me to talk to you about this. And I wish I had more opportunities to have someone interrogate me the way you did. And I hope we engage in a dialogue, because I felt like I had new insights. And, I'm getting very old and it's time for retirement. And so I especially take pleasure in opportunities to have new ideas and think about things in a new way. And it's been a delight, Paul, and I hope we get a chance to do it again without using the computer. So I'll look for you at NCTE. You go to NCTE?
I haven't been before, but I'd like to.
Well, I think it's a pretty decent conference, and I'll keep going for a couple more years at least. And so
maybe I'll see you there then. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a delight, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So long.
Take care.